How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulier Gonzalez here. So in today's video, I want to explore these particular behaviors that we have on developing web applications, like data fetching. But I want to make a quick recap of how do I get here, and particularly these web applications, which are this, right? This is the working group, and to be more explicit about, this is web hypertext applications technology. Or in other words, this is the working group that is overseen by Apple, Mozilla, Opera, and some leader web browsers vendors in 2004. So they are the responsible of maintaining these web-related technical standards, such as the HTML, which is something that I'm going to explore in today's video, the document object model, or the DOM, right? And just is to mention is a couple one. Why this is relevant and important? Well, because if you want to know how to, for example, fetch data in your applications, particularly in React application, which this is the course of Josh Komua, a software engineer that has previously worked at Khan Academy. That was one of the first companies to ever use React at scale. And then he went through Gatsby, and currently now he created this interactive course where we can now not only engage into this by reading it, but also is by understanding is the mechanics. So mechanics, like in the case of React, right? How all of this makes sense. What is the main problem that React offers, and how can we leverage it to create these kinds of applications? Applications that it can be a single landing page or a blog post, right? Or perhaps some more heavy interactive apps like trading apps or gaming, which is there right now a lot of initiative with developing these kind of applications. And most of the time, you will developing or help companies to develop their own SaaS. All right. So in those cases, even though you need to understand is how that works and why this actually make that happen. So I'm not gonna get into the historical details into this, just to briefly mention some of them. So this entire thing called interconnecting computers and sending documents to another computers and command and control, it all started as in DARPA in 1957 as a response to the project, the Soviet program of Sputnik, where they were the first to put now is the satellite over the Earth. And that's actually start this entire race to the bottoms. So DARPA was initially created as a way to detect is any of these physical nuclear tests, fields like geology and astrology actually experiment a boom in those early years. And then now separately there is a bunch of smartphones, nerds that I really love by them, that what they have developing in the universities, for example, like the San Diego and also in DC and the MIT, among other universities, is this ability to now send documents or files from one computer to another, because they ask a question: how now that we have this particular computer that is great at automating is calculations, but sometimes we want to now those calculations store somehow, and then sent over to another computer that can understand that and perhaps do some other experiment or ran some other experiments. So this is what the DARPA agents actually started to look at this with an interest of the military branch, right? So this is why the MIC, or the military industrial complex, actually started to look at this as part of this initiative, okay, on the US. And then it creates now is protocols in how that communications between the devices can happen. So for example, this is why we have things like TCP and the IP, so the transmission control protocol, and the where is the protocol in which we know on this network to locate a computer, right? The IP address. So because at the end of the day, this is a network, and instead of controlling the network, because this becomes like a border control problem, they focused, the mathematicians like Robert Kahn and Vincent Cerf, among other folks, right? So they create now this particular protocol in which these computers can exchange information, right? And then you have all of these different protocol wars, yada yada yada, the like X25, and what eventually has become a standard of how different computers, whatever the organization is, an ARM, or so whether it's RISC or CISC, right? So that's computer wholesome set of instructions that are minimal, reduce, or that has more, or that can cover more complex operations, like complex instruction set, right? So not only in terms of running computations, but also into detect devices that are connected to this computer. So for example, like audio or speaker, something that we are given that by cells, or the mouse or the keyword, which is the OG of how do you interact with this. And after the year progressed, right, a standard was developed on how to make all of these interconnections across systems, known as the OC model, right? And that has become a well-defined standard for those OS implementators. So as the years goes by, and in the early 19th, the CERN, the Committee European pour la recherche nuclear, the CERN, which is the commits, the European commits for the nuclear research, right? So they create, so now in there, peoples like Tim Berners-Lee say, hey, wouldn't it be nice to define a way or a protocol or a standard, a language where it allows us to now share documents, scientific documents, across different computers, right? And they will be part of a protocol of how to transmit that, known as the HTTP. So we have the HTTP, the protocol on how you can transmit these particular documents, scientific documents initially, right? HTML. And then if you want to now style in those documents, you can do that well, using now a language known as the CSS, something that you're going to see that later on. And if you want to provide now interactivity to these documents, right? So for example, it's like, hey, how can I move the mouse, for example? How can I detect that, right? How can I even recognize this input from the keyword in this case, among other kind of events, right? So we need that application, the software, the browser, actually allows to detect those events and programmatically provide some functionality to that. So for example, when we hover here, or this, it provides now some feedback through the user to say, hey, you are now selecting this, you're about to go back to the course or to a homepage. So that's great. Now, why am I doing all of this? It's because as the year progresses, in this application known as the web browsers that allows us to render these documents, which is a fancy way to say, hey, I am receiving this HTML, this language, this structure, this file, and I'm gonna render that to the users so they can interact with this. So this kind of documents that I'm currently looking at is now hosted in a computer that might live close to my locations, thanks to, for example, cloud providers that make this context more close to where I am, known as the catching. Oh my God, I don't recall that. It'll come, but in any case. So given that ability, all right, or given that these service providers, cloud providers, now they make some contracts with the companies and the governments to host and to come to move all of these assets close to the government's borders or the countries, right? The thing here is, well, once that is done, once that deal has settled, well, I can now receive that content much more straightforward, or exactly. So with few delays. But initially, this application was developed in a computer by a developer that live now thousands and thousands miles away from me. Right? Don't know why. I don't think that is too much, but I'm assuming that it's living currently in Canada. Ontario. So he developed that and say, hey, this is a document that I would like to share, put a paywall, because at the end of the day, I'm sharing is my knowledge. So it is up to you as the consumer of these contents to see how you can do and what is benefit from you. So the benefit here is that I'm learning is based on his experience, which is pretty main-bending stuff. Based on his experience and the way how he organized and create this narrative, this story around React, of why we're using React and what is at the end of the day React. Okay, so going a little bit back to the example with the browsers and the HTTP and HTML, and as now we as community on the software community, we see the economic incentive of developing application in this landscape, right? So this is when VCs, private equity, among all or other investors, they see now is the relevance of building on top of this thing called the internet and move the frontiers of what is possible to build, right? I got a quick caveat and perhaps a strong opinion on this. I think that most of these things or this tool that this company have developed is mainly like emergence for complexity, right? So, but in any case, that's my own opinion, but in any case. So, because working and developing these kind of applications HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's required that you know this, right? And as the industry moves, and there's a lot of money burning through these companies, and some of their developers actually receiving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollar in compensations for all the work that they are doing, it turns out that they also develop applications that allows other people to build what they are building. React is one of them, and the problem that React is aiming to solve, right? So again, with that, right, I am right now here because when you started to developing these kind of applications, you first start using something called as the MVC model, which is the traditional way of how you can is based on this framework, you write your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all right? And if you want to interact or when you want to read or write data dynamically from a database, from a store that I mentioned early, right? Well, you can now do that by pulling the data from this database, render your HTML document, and then serve that to other computers. So this is known as the model view controller, where on the model is when you now define is the data layer. The controller is you define is who can get access to this resource and processing some validations. It's like a gatekeeper, pretty much that. And then the view, which is the content that you're going to send over the cable to whoever is asking for it and is allowed to, right? Now, so because developing those kind of apps is something that requires that you have to put a lot of this states, the shared state across different places. It creates now all of this redundancy and all of this maintenance burden. So the React team say, hey, instead of actually having to define all of these different pieces of information that are related to or they are the same across different user interface, let's go into now is merge, store them somehow in a one single place, the single source of truth, whether it's an state. And this is the behavior that at the end of the day React offers to as a use state, right? And then I went through understand now how you can start to use the React. So for like the foundations, like well, what is a create element, what is the JSX, what is the difference between HTML and template engines, how you can do basic stuff on developing web apps, but in React, like rendering a list of elements, conditionally rendering elements, styling components, filling a form, right? Which is what I'm gonna do in today's video, right? And then how you can now is starting to developing applications, blog or landing page, or perhaps you want to is go for some of these heavy interactive applications like games or trading apps, or for more traditional business like B2B SaaS or B2C help desk or applications of that kind of realm, right? So that's great, right? Because now with that understanding here, I also explore is what are the other behaviors that React gave us to. So for example is, hey, you somehow you sometimes might need is a global index, and let me keep track that for you. So this is what we have, use ID. sometimes you need to hold some piece of information so you can later on access through that. That's what you have now used ref. And what is the main use cases for that? You want to interact with an input and select a particular state of that input. Usually is the focus or the placeholder, right? Or you want to now do that for a canvas. And when something happens, you want to render something on that. And the other is perhaps you want to trigger now an audio or a video. You want to control the internal state of these elements, right? So this is a behavior that React allows to. And then it comes with some rules on when you can use in the React context and so on and so forth. After that, right? After that, give me a quick pause. I'll be right back. All right. Got it. So with that, right? Got it. So with that, and after I've explored is this particularly behaviors in which we React gave us to as a developers. Another is the use effect. So anytime that you need to synchronize with an external things, all right, and make that aware on the React, you can do that, but using is the use effect. And it has a particular mechanism to do that, which is now you provide the callback function and then you have the cleanup function. And what's happening is that anytime that, so it has a particular life cycle, right? I'm not gonna dive into this. What I can describe is a couple examples that I have passed and developed. For example, detecting now keystrokes to trigger is, let's say, in an audio player, all right, which is the most common use case was when you hit enter, you want to actually pause or yeah, so pause or play that audio or even video, right? And that was a very interesting example too. And also is that when the user is navigating in a particular section, so now you have is a particular web API that detects when the user navigates at which place. So it can fire up an event. So you as a developer can detect that and run your own magic. So this is part of the effects and the hooks, and how you can actually combine this notion of or to develop the notion of the components instance and the rendering process, right? So as I look also for example, how can we define our own behaviors like custom hooks, right? Which is something that React has a particular way to define your own app level behaviors, okay? So for example, detecting things like the mouse or the resize of an element, so on and so forth, okay? If you are developing a Figma app, that might be quite convenient. So to detect, for example, is the dimension of a particular box. So you want to know how much that and update the dimensions of that box, right? So you can start to do very interesting things with this. But what I want to do in today's video finally is the data fetching. So because at the end of the day, the initial way to do this is on the web is using a form, HTML form. This is exactly what am I going to do in today's video. you might need to also, so there's some couple prerequisites, right? So you need to, it is good to understand, right, the origins of sending data using an HTML form, and then why we have techniques like Ajax programming, which was developed by a Microsoft team, where they say, hey, it'll makes a lot of, it'll be you know. So it makes much more sense to looking at this, right? The synchronous and asynchronous code, and to wiring up or to understand this Ajax thing, or this techniques that allows to in JavaScript send data and receive that using now the XML HTTP request, which is an object that allows to describe, and it is part of the spec, right? That it say, hey, this is the way of how you can transfer data. So don't take my word for granted. You can also navigate today and say, hey, this is now Ajax, right? Ajax living standards, right? Sorry for my bad English. Living standards, right? Why you don't want to show the living standard, right? That's interesting. You got a bad, right? It's got a very bad. It's because that's not the name of this, because the standard is XML HTTP requests. Okay, so it's up to the client that say, hey, I want to now somehow is to transfer data. So requests for the document, whatever document it is, all right? But over this protocol. So here is how you can do that. Ajax was just the techniques developing around this, which was very popular back then, right? And then, because most of those results that the browser fetch, they need to, so for example, oh my God, no, what are you doing? Okay. So for example, there are some couple resources that we need to fetch, and each one of those resources has their own implementation, so there is no standard to fetch them. So for example, it's fetching image or script elements, right? Or CSS cursor for the user interactivity at the styling layer, and list style image, the navigator send beacon. Interesting. I'm not quite well aware of this. How to mention is how you import some script in the JavaScript API, right? So because the ability to fetch resources is all over the place, so now the people that oversee these standards again is the WHAT, right? The Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, a bunch of people that works on Apple and Opera and Mozilla and other major vendors, browser major vendors, right? So they have now this, right? And they say, hey, no, let's going to simplify our life. Let's going to use now this fetch API, right? Which expose most of the networking functionality at a fairly low level of abstractions. So in other words, is describing is what the fetch API is doing. In other words, is to define standards for a request, a response, and the process that binds them, right? So that's interesting. that just describe a lot of this. So, and also you need to understand now for the asynchronous nature in JavaScript, right? What is synchronous? What is asynchronous? What is HTTP, as I mentioned before? What is this thing called promise? What is the fetch APIs? What is also the way to fetch now data, and the async and away, right? So with that huge introduction, Jesus, French was that. Well, finally, is to look at the Q&A that I made for the fetching resource here at the form. I think is here under the form, right? So under the form, okay, it requires you, so writing a form consists of several steps. The UI, which is already defined here, right? This is a form to order pizza, right? So we define the customer name, telephone, and email. We also now diving into the type of inputs that we can have. So strings or tell or even email, right? For example, is the radio buttons to define is one of the size you want your pizza. You want to make your pizza. The other is the pizza toppings, right? But now is with a multi-selections. Again, all of these come from forms, basic simple forms. And so you got this checkbox, right? You can also use another type that date and what is the value that it gives you. For example, if you're using in this way, or if you use now the datetime locale for that, which gives you is now in a ISO format without the time zone. In this ISO format, and I know that I'm getting perhaps too into the weeds, is a way of how you can establish time over worldwide communications. So that's good. That's great. That's also quite deep and involved. And here we are, right? This is part of the ISO standard, as you can see here, right? Input authors, right? This is part of the standard. And so yeah, so is this one. Holy moly, it's 1.2 gigabytes in memory. 1 gigabyte memory. Holy French. Anyway, massive. Okay. Anyway, but this is it, right? So anytime that you want to define now a form, all right, to collect data and then to send that to a server, so there is a couple of steps. There is no order, but you need to implement all of them. So first is writing the user interface. I already did. The other is implementing the server-side processing, and then configure the user interface to communicate with the server. So on implementing the server-side rendering logic here, right? There are a couple things here. So the exact detail for writing a server-side processor are out of the scope of this spec. And for the purpose of this introduction, we will assume that the script at the URL is configured to accept submissions using applications X triple form URL encoded format. So there's a couple questions here. Expecting the following parameters, send in an HTTP post body. Okay, I actually took notes of my questions, right? Some of them might be silly, but you get the idea. Is that what is a server-side processor? And why do we need to have a route like pizza with that extension to accept exactly with with that extension, okay, with that extension to accept submissions in this format. And the other is parameter send in the HTTP body. So what is an HTTP post? Right? Something like that. So I do want to ask these couple questions real quick to Claw. All right. And right now you're not going to see that I'm going to do that. Just going to open up a new tab here. Right. And I'm going to now ask Claw about this. Right. So, hey, Claw. I do have a couple of questions from the, and I indicating is the source of this, okay, which is here. Nope. Which is here. Okay. Oh my God! What the French does? You got. That's right. Why you don't want to show this? You like to play games with me? Okay, you are like playing games with me. Okie dokie. It is holding. Yes. Where is this, man? Oh, did you close that? Oh no, there you got it. Okay. Since I wanna understand it once and for all. All right. So my couple questions here are like, hey, okay. Okay, since I want to understand it once and for all of this, right? And that is these couple questions. Okay, that's it. right? So if you need to research for that, let's get into this, all right? So when you submit an HTML form, the browser packages up the form data and sends it somewhere. The somewhere is the URL, and whatever lives at the URL and receive and handles the data is the server-side processor. So this server-side processor is whatever it leaves at that URL, sometimes called the form handler or server-side script. This space is deliberately vague here because HTML doesn't care how you handle the submission. The browser job ends at serializing the forms, fields, and send an HTTP request to the action URL. What happened after that? Validating the data right into a database. Exactly. So the only thing that it cares is the browser job is to serialize the form field and send the HTTP request to the action URL. So what happened after that? Validating the data, or reading or writing to the database, charging a credit card, sending a confirmation email. It is entirely up to the server. Reading in whatever language runtime you like. Given your background, that processor is most likely an express router, so is where we define like this. Okay, the app post order, and when you go to that. So in your word, server-side processor is the endpoint handling that consumer, all right? So nothing more mystical than that. So in other words, server-side processor is whoever is on the other side at the URL, at that location, that is going to receive that and process that somehow. So the browser job is just to serialize the form fields and sending an HTTP request to that action URL, usually as a post. And the browser jobs ends to serialize the form field and send an HTTP request to the action URL. Exactly. So it is entirely on your server responsibility, reading in whatever language or runtime you like. Given your background is that. So the other question here, so that is like, why do we need to have a route like this, especially with that extension to accept submissions on that format? Okay, is about this. URL with the .ci extension. Short answer: the .ci extension is historically artifacts and mean nothing special to HTML. The spec author pick up a flavor detail, not a requirement. The longer story, okay, it's an extension, it's an historical artifact and means nothing special to HTML. .cgi refers to commonly gateway interface, an old school conventions from the 19th for how a web server handles an incoming request off to an external executable script. Back then, you literally drop a Perl or C script named order.cgi into the CGI bin directory, and the web server Apache was configured to execute files with that extension rather than serving as static files. Interesting. The extension was how the server knew run this, don't just send its content. Okay, common gateway interface. Today, that's almost entirely obsolete because it's when the browser detects this, it's going to run that script. And therefore, it's creating a process. And when you create a process, you are reserving a space in memory for that. So today, that's almost entirely obsolete. In modern stack, the routing is decoupled from the file system entirely. Your actions could point to order, an API v1 order, or anything else. and your framework's routers map the path to a handler. There is no extension, no CBin, and no per request process span. Okay. Okay. Got it. Mm-hmm. 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 Interesting. Very, very, very interesting here. Mm-hmm. The key point of understanding the spec is the action attribute. Okay. Okay. So there is no extension, no CBin, no per request process span. So the key point to understand the spec, the actions attribute is just a URL. The browser doesn't parse or care about the extension. You could write the order and it works identically. The spec order.cgi is essentially the HTML equivalent of using the foo and bar encode example. Don't read intent into it. As for the application XWWW form URL encoded part, that's the default encoding for form submission. And this is the notion of encoding, character encoding here. And it is separate from the URL itself. It helps the browser to serialize the form. Oh, look at this. It helps the browser to serialize the form field as key value, pair joins by an ampersand with a special character percentage encoded. A G like this. Okay, key value, and the next one, and the next one. So this is the same format you see in URL query string. The two other valid end type are multipart form data, which you need for file uploads, and text plain, which you should basically never use, of course, because you should never update that things as it is. So there is a very interesting question here. It opened up two questions here. It opens up a two question here. All right. So the TL of it is that what are the server-side processor? It's just a fancy an agnostic way to say whoever is in the location at the URL, all right, for this case, right, so for this case is this, for our case, this, right, whoever is there, okay, so whoever is there, whoever is in the location at the URL, for our case this, will process exactly whatever lives at the URL and receive and handles the data is the server processing. Okay, so that makes a ton of sense. It's just a fancy and agnostic way to say whoever leave right, in that location, whoever live in that location here, so whoever live in that whoever live at that URL, okay, and receive and handle data, exactly, whoever live at that URL and receive and sends data, right? And receiving handles data, because that's what it is the server side. And receive and handles data, right, is the server side. Okay. Okay. Is the server side. Got it? Okay. So this so in our case, so if you are exactly. So if in our case, this one, and receiving handles data is the server side. Okay, so whatever language you use to write for that, it is, right? So the server side processor is the endpoint handlers that consumes the submission. So is the endpoint, in this case, is the endpoint handle, is the endpoint handling that, is the endpoint handler that consumes the submission. Is the endpoint handler that consumes the submission. Okay, so that's good. And then the other is this, right? So why do we have a route like this, like CGI, right? So because with URL CGI, it's an historical artifact and means nothing special. This refers to CGI common interface. So CGI common interface refers to an old school convention for how web server hands an incoming request off to external executable script. Back then, you literally drop a per or C script name order CGI into the CG bin directory, and the web server Apache, right, was configured to execute files with that extension rather than serving as a static files. So it is a convention. It is an old school convention, right? That this is how web server handles exactly. It's an old school convention of how web browsers and how web servers handles incoming request. Interesting. Okay. Request off to an external executable script. Back then, you literally drop so you say back then. So back then you literally drop a script a Perl or C script, a Perl or C script into the file directory. Name in this case is order.cgi common gateway interface, okay, under a folder into a CGI bin or into a CGI bin folder like this, right? That's interesting. I'm gonna put it here into a bin folder, right? Exactly, folder. And the web server, okay, exactly. Back then you literally write a script or drop. You literally right? You literally drop a Percy script under that, and then it's up to the web server. And the web server was configured to execute files. And the web server was configured to execute files with that extension. Rather than serve them as a static file, which is something that we give that by settle. Interesting, right? Interesting. The extension was how the server knew run this, than just saying it is content. Today, that is almost entirely obsolete. In modern stack, the routing is decoupling from the file system entirely, right? So right now, the routing in modern web developers, in modern or in modern stack, right now in modern stack, the routing is separated from the file system. That's right. So you have, depends if you're running at runtime or not, but they are separated too. Okay. And your framework's routers map that path to a handler. Exactly. So your action could point it to order or anything else, and your framework's router maps that path to a handler. So your browser can send the data. Okay, so your action could point. So your action could point to exactly. Your action could point to the route order, and it's up to the framework, and it is up to the framework, whatever it is, Ruby on Rails, or Apache, or in this case can be Node or Express or GraphQL, and it's up to the framework to runs that, right? To maps that path to a handler. To a handler. And there is no extension. No exactly. And this is the core here. So there is no process here. So there is no extension, no cbin, or CGI bin, no CGI bin folder. Exactly. So no per request process, no per request process spawn. And that makes a ton of sense. And the other is the key point to understand this spec. The action attribute is just a URL. The browser doesn't parse or care about the extension. You could write here form action / order and method pose. Okay, so this is just to describe one. This is one question, one answer to this. Makes a ton of sense. So this web servers, right, can now detect an incoming request. Okay, they can detect an incoming request, and then now, so you drop a script on C or Perl, and it is up to that application, that software, the web server, to route that to execute that, right? To execute that file rather than serving a static. And when you execute now a file, you are effectively creating is a process. And a process is something that is spanned by taking now memory and the CPU to run that instruction, to run that program, right? This is when a process is created, right? So when you execute a set of instructions that sits on disk and you mount them into memory, and then you call the CPU to execute on those instructions in memory, that's when you create a process. So let me actually write it down here. In a process, for the example of the CGI, order CGI, is a set of instructions. It's a set of instructions or a file, okay, that sits on disk, and when the OS mount that in memory and execute and call the CPU to execute it, that's when a process is created. Oh, it's already. No, that's the program or the executable. That's the program or the executable. Okay. 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 No. That sits on disk and the OS mount that in memory and call the CPU to execute it. So, exactly. Is when a file an executable. Exactly. It's when an executable file, okay, that sits on disk, is when an executable file, okay, that sits on disk architecture, whether it is RAM or x60, x86, that sits on disk. Low. A process is when an executable file that sits on disk is loaded by the OS into memory and call the CPU to execute it. But do you read what I'm telling you? You know, so a process is when a process is created when an executable file is loaded into memory by the OS. Exactly. A process is created when an executable file that sits on disk is loaded into memory and executed by the OS as a way to keep track of this operation. So this is the entire notion of this, right? And to answer another question, which is a process. Okay, no per request process spans, and a process is created when a file that when an executable binary is when an executable file, okay, an executable file for that architecture okay, a process is created when an executable file okay, so a process is created when an executable file for that architecture a process is created when an executable file created for that architecture by a compiler, all right, or an interpreter, okay? It's to be very specific about this, you know? To be very specific about this. Okay. So a process is created where an executable file created for that architecture, whether it's RAM or x86, right? By a compiler or an interpreter. Yeah, a process is created when an executable file created for that architecture by a compiler or an interpreter is loaded by the OS, okay, into the memory and calls the CPU to execute it. This is why it's notoriously elegant but slow. Holy moly. Okay. To a worker process model like that. Interesting. Okay, got it. Got it. So a process is created when an executable file is created for that architecture by a compiler or an interpreter. It is loaded by the OS into the memory and called the CPU to execute it. So if you imagine, so as you can imagine, so as you can imagine, so as you can imagine, it creates a process per request, right? So making it note that So that answer is that particular question. All right, that answer that particular question. Okay, and the other question is, okay, so why do we need to have a route like this? All right, with that extension. right? And another question is like this. So after that, I can say something like this. So what is the accept submissions? What is this application format here? Okay. Okay, so that'll be all for the video. Take care. Bye-bye.